These are excerpts from the last chapter in Rashid Khalidi's book, The 100-Year War of Palestine. And I found it really poignant in some of the issues that he raises and the solutions that he suggests for the current conflict. August 1947 marked the beginning of decolonization, when British rule in India ended. It was in those days of hope and fulfillment that decolonization of Palestine occurred. Thus, at the dawn of decolonization, we were returned to the earliest, most intensive form of colonial menace, exclusivist settler colonialism. But they had been trying to do the impossible, impose a colonial reality on Palestine in a post-colonial age. The Zionist movement, in the words of the late historian Tony Junt, arrived too late, as it imported a characteristically late 19th century separatist project into a world that had moved on. Establishing the colonial nature of the conflict has been proven exceedingly hard given the biblical dimensions of Zionism, which cast the new arrivals as indigenous and as the historic proprietors of the land they colonized. In this light, the original population of Palestine appears extraneous to the post-Holocaust resurgence of a Jewish nation-state with its roots in the kingdom of David and Solomon. They are no more than undesirable interlopers in this uplifting scenario. Challenging this epic myth is especially difficult in the United States, which is steeped in an evangelical Protestantism that makes it particularly susceptible to such an evocative Bible-based appeal, and which also prides itself in its colonial past. The terms settler and pioneer have positive connotations in American history, arising from the heroic tales of the conquest of the West at the expense of its indigenous population, as projected in movies, literature, and television. Indeed, there are striking parallels between these portrayals of the resistance of Native Americans and that of Palestinians. Both groups are cast as backwards and uncivilized, a violent, murderous, and irrational obstacle to progress and modernity. While many Americans have begun to contest this strand of their national narrative, Israeli society and its supporters still celebrate, indeed depend on, its foundational version. The Palestinians ought to treat the United States as an extension of Israel. As a superpower, it would necessarily be represented at any talks, but it should be considered an adversarial party, seated with Israel on the opposite side of the table. For decades, Zionists insisted, often referring to the state's Declaration of Independence, that Israel could be and was both Jewish and democratic. As the contradictions inherent in this formulation grew even more apparent, some Israeli leaders admitted, indeed even declared it with pride, that if they were forced to choose, the Jewish aspect would take precedence. In July 2018, the Knesset codified the choice in the constitutional law, adopting the Basic Law on the Jewish Nation-State, which institutionalized statutory inequality amongst Israeli citizens by arrogating the right of national self-determination exclusively to the Jewish people, downgrading the status of Arabic, and declaring Jewish settlement a national value, with precedence over other needs. In the equally blunt words of Likud Knesset member Miki Zohar, the Palestinian, he said, does not have the right of self-determination because he is not the proprietor of the land. I regret to say it, but they suffer from one major defect. They were not born Jews. This connection between an exclusive right to land and peoplehood is central to a specific type of blood and soil, Central European nationalism, which is the ground from which Zionism sprang. By embracing its illiberal and discriminatory essence, modern Zionism is increasingly in contradiction with the ideals, particularly that of equality, on which Western democracies are based. This leaves the thorny issue of how to wean Israelis from their attachment to inequality, which is often coded as and justified by a need for security. This perceived need is to a large extent rooted in a real history of insecurity and persecution. But in response to this past trauma, generations have now been brought up on a reflexive dogma of aggressive nationalism whose tenacious hold will be hard to break. Thus, the Jewish citizens of a regional superpower that cows its neighbors and has bombed the capitals of 7 of them with impunity, suffer from a deep insecurity rooted in part in this history, and perhaps in part from an unspoken concern that the carefully constructed and justified colonial reality that they live in might suddenly unravel. The syndrome that drives this imperative to dominate and discriminate can probably only be addressed by those within Israeli society, or close to it, who understand the grim direction of the country's current course, and who can challenge the distortions of history, ethics, and Judaism that this ideology constitutes. Doing so is surely the primary and most urgent task of Israelis and their supporters who wish to change the dynamics of injustice and inequality. Palestinians, too, need weaning from a pernicious delusion rooted in the colonial nature of their encounter with Zionism and its denial of Palestinian peoplehood. That Jewish Israelis are not a real people and that they do not have national rights. While it is true that Zionism has transmuted the Jewish religion and the historic peoplehood of Jews into something quite different, a modern nationalism, this does not erase the fact that Israeli Jews today consider themselves a people with a sense of national belonging in Palestine, when they think of as the land of Israel. Palestinians, too, today consider themselves a people with national links to what is indeed their ancestral homeland, for reasons that are as arbitrary as any of the reasons that led to the emergence of scores of modern national movements. The irony is that, like all peoples, Palestinians assume that their nationalism is pure and historically rooted while denying the same of Israeli Jews. There is, of course, a difference between the two. The former are indigenous, the latter settlers or descendants of settlers, although many have now been there for generations and have a deeply felt and ancient religious connection to their country. Because this is a colonial conflict, this difference matters enormously. However, no one today would deny that fully developed national entities exist in several states like the United States, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, despite the origin in colonial wars of extermination. A forgotten but essential element of the Palestinian political agenda is work inside Israel, specifically convincing Israelis that there is an alternative to the ongoing oppression of the Palestinians. This is a long-term process that cannot be dismissed as a form of normalizing relations with Israel. Neither the Algerian nor the Vietnamese short-sightedly deny themselves the opportunity to convince public opinion in the home country of their oppressor of the justice of their cause, efforts that contributed measurably to their victory, nor should the Palestinians. Settler colonial confrontations with indigenous peoples have only ended in one of three ways: with the elimination or full subjugation of the native population, as in North America, with the defeat and the expulsion of the colonizer, as in Algeria, which is extremely rare, or with the abandonment of colonial supremacy in the context of compromise and reconciliation, as in South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Ireland. Overcoming the resistance of those who benefit from the status quo in order to ensure equal rights for all in the small country between the Jordan River and the sea. This is a test of the political ingenuity of all concerned. Only such a path, based on equality and justice, is capable of concluding the 100 Years' War in Palestine with a lasting peace, one that brings with it the liberation that the Palestinian people deserve.